Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor, and a very warm welcome to my Herald podcast. Now, a bit of a change this week. We're going out live, although you'll also still be able to catch up later, whatever works for you. This week on the show, will it ever end? Now, I'm not talking about Scotland's trials and tribulations in international football, although we will get to that, hopefully with an upbeat tone, an upbeat note. Rather, I'm referring to the pandemic and to the prolonged constraints on all of us. Will it ever end? Question a lot of folk are asking. The question certainly the hospitality industry is asking. They're warning of another lost summer with an impact upon trade, an impact upon jobs, and other businesses say too that they're at breaking point. What's your take? Do you back the cautious approach? Is that necessary, or are you fed up of the entire thing? Let's chat with my guests today. I'm delighted to welcome the SNP MP Drew Henry, Ros Foyer, the General Secretary of the Scottish TUC, Andy McKeever from the consultancy group Message Matters, and my Herald colleague Alistair Grant. Thanks very much to you for all joining me. Pandemic constraint, first of all. Ros Foyer, let's go with you. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon we had the Prime Minister announcing an extension of it was hoped to be Freedom Day. Nicola Sturgeon said she never used that sort of language, but in either way, the message from the two leaders is it's yet further constraint. Is that necessary? It must be causing a lot of worry to a lot of employees and a lot of folk in jobs.
Well, I think the key point to be made here is that compromising on safety is a false economy. So I actually welcome the cautious approach. I think it's a lack of caution, perhaps, on travel restrictions and other areas that's actually got into this mess with the extended need for restrictions. And, the last thing we need is there are new strains of the virus coming in all the time. They will find ways of getting around vaccines. They will become more aggressive, the strains that come in. And so we have to give time to get the population fully vaccinated before we loosen constraints too early. I think the key point is that while constraints are necessary, what is also necessary is providing full and adequate support for employers and employees to be able to follow those restrictions.
And do you believe that is being done at the present moment, or is it falling shy?
That is where we're falling shy. That's where the real problem lies in protecting our economy. So, while we've got the worst statutory sick pay across almost the whole developed world, we have a problem with containing this pandemic. And while we're not offering support to business to the required levels, we have a problem. And also, we have to make sure that we're now extending the furlough. If we're extending the restrictions, we have to take that furlough right through to the end of the year, because at the end of this month, people's jobs will start getting cancelled because of the withdrawal of the furlough scheme beginning. So we are in a really dire straits. We need government to extend the furlough and do it now and send some clear messaging around that.
Thanks for that. Andy McKeever, you take the pulse, the temperature of the business sector. Mentioned earlier, Scottish Licensed Trade Association saying that at breaking point, that's a common message, isn't it, from a number of business sectors?
Absolutely. And obviously over the last couple of weeks, a lot of the hospitality sector in particular is highlighting what they see as the double standard of having the fan zone open at Glasgow Green and having 6,000 people there, but not having their restaurant open, for instance. I think that, broadly speaking, I don't think any of them want to go backwards. So I don't think it's a case of throwing caution to the wind necessarily, but I think it's about understanding. And one of the things that I think government's not been good at, north and south of the border, I think the government have dealt with this basically pretty well. Their styles have been very different. Their communications have been very different. There's no question about that. But I think both governments deserve a lot of credit for dealing with a situation which nobody could really foresee. And although there's been a little bit of chaos, and I think that you would see that everywhere in the world. So I'm not really a critic of how the government have dealt with it. One thing I would like to see from the government is more of an analysis over when the cure is worse than the disease. So when are we at the point where lockdown is actually more dangerous than the virus? And that's where the vaccine comes into it, because at the end, we are at the point now where groups 1 to 9, everybody over 50, has been double vaccinated, or is very close to that point anyway.
Or has had the opportunity,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're at the point now where we're saying that actually those who are at risk of illness from this have been vaccinated. And that makes things materially different. So I understand why businesses are becoming increasingly frustrated with the situation because they see a situation where the risk is low. We're being told by people like Chris Whitty that we now have to live with this. And I don't think we can continue to say, what if another variant comes down the road? We better keep everything closed. You can't live like that. There comes a point where you think
the emergency provisions were okay were essential for an actual emergency, but now we're into the live with it, a phrase that Nicola Sturgeon says she doesn't like, incidentally, but I don't understand why, because she says you're using the word live when so many people have actually died. But that is live with it, deal with it, cope with it, carry on with it, coexist with it, whatever. But you're saying we need to maybe move on a bit from that.
Well, yes, and it's to be fair, it's not just me saying that. I mean, I'm going back about 6 weeks when Chris Whitty said we now have to treat this like seasonal flu. And people die from seasonal flu every year. And of course, it's a terrible thing for those people, but we don't shut down the country because of it. And it's about whether or not the shutdown is actually placing more people at risk. Because as Ros will know, this is about lives as well. Lockdown is about people losing livelihoods. It's about poverty.
Yes.
It's about loss of years of life because of these things. And so I think the one thing that the government and both governments, probably all governments around the world, have not been good at is modelling when the risk of lockdown has exceeded the risk of COVID. And we must, I think, be really close to that point.
Drew Henry, Nicola Sturgeon suggested on that very point that she's going to make the decision next week, but there's no doubt that she will extend. We will not be going to level 0 on June the 28th in Scotland, as was anticipated, just as in England they're not going to Freedom Day on June 21. But she said there'll be a couple of publications next week of. She was reluctant to use the phrase "live with it," but that was basically what it was. It was how we cope with the continuation of this virus. What's your take on this? What about this balance between we cannot go on in constant lockdown and constant constraints. We're going to have to open up eventually. Either the vaccine works or it doesn't.
Well, I think that's why we've really got to get a good head of steam ahead of this virus in terms of getting the vaccine rolled out. One thing that's not come up in the conversation so far, although I agree with everything Ros said, is that this is a global pandemic. And the virus is still out there circulating around the planet just now, quite unchecked in a number of places. So we have got to be sure that when we open things up, it's not just a matter of saying, right, we've got to where we are now. We need to make sure that those lessons have been learned. And I think they have been learned, but I think that's why Nicola Sturgeon is so cautious. I think we've got to learn those lessons that say when we open up, it's got to be done in a way that's going to not just protect us for the moment, but also protect us into the future. But Ros was making a couple of really critical points that I think, both spill over into workers and employers and into those businesses. The level of support has to be there to make sure that people are able to continue to have their businesses, continue to be employed into the future. And furlough should be extended for as long as it's necessary under this pandemic. And it shouldn't be tapered off as the UK government is planning to do at the moment, reducing it down to 70%. They shouldn't be removing the £1,000 from universal credit. And what they should be doing, we were promised £350 billion to be injected into loans into the economy. Only a fifth of that has been used, Brian. There's plenty of scope there for some of that money to be transferred into grants to take the pressure off businesses and to allow us to do even more to support them. And finally, I would say in terms of that support, something I've been calling on for well over a year, in addition to all the things like retaining the VAT cut for longer and furlough, etc., is to give Scotland some of these minor changes we require to borrowing power so that we can do more here in Scotland as well to support those businesses.
Andy, then Alistair. Yeah, Andy here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing which, in many ways correctly, we don't focus on here is the next 50 years. And I do sometimes think that when we're talking about extensions of furlough and all that sort of stuff, we never mention the fact that our children and grandchildren are going to have to pay for it. This is not free. This is our money, right? It's our money. And we have to pay it back. And the scale of borrowing, I mean, we talked about the borrowing for the banking crash 10, 12 years ago. This makes that look like pocket money. The scale of money that's having to be spent on this pandemic is absolutely.
And are you saying it's unaffordable, Andy? You're saying it's unaffordable?
You can make a financial choice over.
I'm going to say, let Andy finish, and I'll bring in Ross and Drew. Yeah.
Again, this is about choices. We can do things to make sure that certain outcomes happen now, but what we shouldn't do is do them pretending there aren't any consequences of that. There are massive consequences of all these big decisions, and they will last for decades, and our children and grandchildren will have to pick up the tab.
Alistair, if you can be patient for a second, Ross, you were desperate to get in and Drew, yeah.
Really like to come in that, because our children and grandchildren are going to have to pick up the tab if we don't put the investment in now.
Exactly.
First of all, it's absolutely crucial that where businesses would be viable in normal times, that we do everything possible to keep those businesses and keep those jobs going, because it's much harder to create new jobs than it is to keep the businesses that are there and give the support that business needs now. I think it's really, really, we need to look back at the amount of investment that was put in post-war years to rebuild the economy, and we also need to look at the amount of investment that other countries are looking to put in. I mean, the scale and the ambition of the British government compared to Germany at the moment, or the US at the moment, is very, very low. They're not looking at putting the level of investment in that's going to be required to properly rebuild our economy, and so we really need to be asking for us to think big and be quite bold in our borrowing right now as a country in order to make sure.
I'm going to bring in Andy again. Andy,
I don't disagree. I'm just highlighting the fact that there's another side of the balance sheet here. It is a balance between what you put in now and what you account for happening in the future. I'm not arguing against it. I'm arguing for probably a little bit longer term thinking as to what the impact is.
Alistair Grant, we've had questions raised in the House of Commons about the handling of this pandemic. We've had questions raised only today in the Scottish Parliament about the handling of the pandemic. We had a statement earlier in the week from the First Minister. It's that they're trying to sound upbeat, but I thought, if I may say so, the Prime Minister in particular, when he made the statement and announcing the delay, it really was quite a problem for him. It's a problem in terms of message as well as content, isn't it?
It is a problem in terms of message. And just go back just really briefly to something that Andy was touching on. We've had the kind of problems with the fan zone in Glasgow. And I think this kind of speaks into a wider issue where different sectors feel like they are being treated differently. So, for example, I think one of the most kind of glaring examples of that is in the difference in physical distancing rules. So we've got, the 1 meter rule in hospitality and bars and restaurants. And then for theatres and live entertainment, you've got a 2 meter distancing rule, which is just completely unviable for lots of, unless you're getting huge subsidies, that's completely unviable for lots of venues. So I think looking ahead to next week, we've obviously got, as you said, these different papers coming out. I think that paper on physical distancing will be absolutely crucial in determining whether or not...
Forgive me interrupting, but Nicola Sturgeon hinted, didn't she, if you can pick up on this, that she might try and, what did she call it? It was minor matters or consequential matters or something, while keeping the broad idea of maintaining the constraints as they are.
She did, yeah. She said they basically promised to consider whether any minor changes can be made to the current levels as they are. So that would be,
that could be numbers of weddings or something like that. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
Something like that. It could even be something around physical distancing. It could be something around, we've had problems recently with nursery graduations, stuff like that. Parents really wanting to go to these transitional events in schools that are held outside, but being told that basically they can't, which when they look at, just go back to the fan zone in Glasgow, you've got 6,000 fans a day, 3,000 per session in a city where...
I've lost count of the number of times I've heard that raised. People say, if they can go to that, why can't I go to, my kids' primary school?
And it's a city that's currently under level 2 restrictions, which basically means that for these outdoor seated events, you should have a maximum capacity of 500. So it is quite
Sorry, Drew Henry, was that a bit of a slip? I mean, I understand why they wanted to go ahead. They want to give people something. The argument was they're going to watch the game anyway, do it under control. But it was a bit of a PR nightmare, wasn't it?
Well, I'm not a clinician or a scientist, and I don't give the government advice on these things. But I did listen to Professor Jason Leach talking about the fact that decisions have been made around sport that mean that there are relaxations there that are not happening elsewhere. And he was making the point that you just can't do everything. You can't do that across everything in Scotland.
What you've said is basically fundamentally unfair. Folk are not going to say, "Oh, it's fine, it's sport, it's okay." They're going to say, "I can't go to my daughter's nursery graduation or kindergarten graduation or whatever it is. I can't go to this. They're not going to say, oh, fine, on you go, it's a Scotland game. They're going to say, this is wrong for me. It's unfair, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the difficult choices that are being made at the moment about these different things. You know, that there are, and there have been on this podcast, different views about what relaxation should happen and what should happen in terms of what's going forward. And I think there will be different views. I think the fact is that when you're making these choices, and I'm very, very thankful I'm not in the position of having to react to these personally. When you're making these choices, they must be really difficult. And I'm sure they've been all being taken with great care. I'm not in the room, but I'd imagine there's a lot of sleepless nights and sweating about this.
You're a member of Parliament. You're getting constituents having a go at you, no doubt, or raising these issues with you. Well, what is your own take? Was it a blunder? Was the fan zone a blunder?
Well, no, I don't believe it was, because I think what we'll see today, we know that, fans are travelling down to London just now, and there's no facility for them there in place. That just means they're going to congregate somewhere else. I hope not, because they've been asked not to travel if they haven't got tickets or somewhere to go to. But I think it is appropriate, when you know that something like that is going to happen, that you take some kind of action to make sure you can at least kind of contain it or manage it. And I think that's what's been done. Now, I'm sitting here talking to you from Inverness. I'm in the centre of hospitality for Scotland, and I know exactly what people are saying about this and how unfair they feel it is. And I feel that as well, because these are my friends and neighbours that are being affected by this just now. And that's why I think the fact that there hasn't been enough support coming, there hasn't been enough allowance from Westminster to allow us to properly support these businesses, to keep furlough going, has been so important. And we need some of that loan money transferred into grants so that we can put that in to these businesses to make it easier for them at the moment.
Alistair, Alistair, please. Yeah,
it's just a very brief point in that, and I think a lot of people accept that you do have to make decisions, and some things will be able to open and some things won't be. But I think that the problem at the moment is, and I thought this the other day when Nicola Sturgeon stood up in Parliament and said there will often be rational explanations behind why these decisions are made. I think you have a duty to the public to lay out exactly what those rational explanations are and why those decisions have been made, why the decision has been made for theatres, for example, to be 2 metre distancing, but bars and restaurants to be 1 metre distancing.
And you don't think that's been done properly?
I don't think it's clear enough at the moment as to what exactly the thinking is behind that. I mean, personally, because I don't know what it is.
Andy McKeever.
I think this is not something which we do very well in this country, but I think we have to try and give politicians a bit of space to rectify little errors that they make. This is an unprecedented situation. They can't get everything right, okay? And I think somebody like Jason Leach is actually very good at admitting where things are not quite keeping up in terms of regulation with what's going on.
Yeah, but he's not standing for election. He can say that.
Well, indeed, but I think that collectively it would be better if we can give the politicians a bit of time.
Couldn't agree more.
Tinker where they've got things wrong. I mean, a good example at schools. I mean, I've got 4 kids in primary school, and a good example there is not actually the sports day stuff, right? Let's be fair. The sports day stuff is upsetting the parents more than it's upsetting the children, and it's a big thing. Don't get me wrong. I would like to have gone, and I couldn't go, and I thought it was wrong. Yeah. But
would you take part in the dad digging spoon race? So that's the thing.
Well,
would you?
Always take part in these things, Brian.
Quite right.
But one of the things that they've still got this what's called the bubbles policy at school.
Yeah.
So my children are not allowed to play with their friends during the day between 9 and 3, even outside, because they're in a different bubble. Even though they go to breakfast club and after school club with them in the school, sitting next to them, they can't see them between 9 and 3. Now, privately, when I've spoken to people, everybody knows that's wrong. Everybody knows it's silly. Everybody knows they have to change it. But you've got to give people space to make these little changes without slapping U-turn or backpedal or stuff over it. I think
great stuff. Let me bring in Roz on one, an area where an error was admitted. Nicola Sturgeon saying today didn't get everything right. Anna Sawar from the Scottish Labour was raising the PPE, protective equipment for staff in hospitals and clinics and care areas. Now, there's an Audit Scotland report saying very, very close to running out. Didn't run out, but very, very close to running out. What do you make of that from a sort of staff perspective?
Well, it's no surprise to us that was the situation in the central stocks, because we had reps at that period in the pandemic. Literally, we had people fighting tooth and nail to get a hold of PPE for their members throughout that initial period, and it was perfectly clear that there wasn't enough PPE. We had issues over PPE in the ambulance service. We had issues right across the care sector with PPE and quality of PPE. We had issues with different grades within our healthcare services and their access to PPE.
Staff must have been terrified.
Should have been.
Staff must have been terrified by that, when they not.
I think it's hard to overstate the fear. We talk about key workers going out and how they're all heroes and everything, but this has been a really traumatizing experience for thousands of frontline public sector workers. And I'm very sad to say that actually low pay across these workforces have been most essential in looking after the rest of us is endemic. And the amount of, the quality of PPE training and a whole range of other things sometimes is very low due to the fact that our public services have been run down with austerity over many years. So we've got key lessons to learn from this pandemic. And one of them is that bad work kills, and that we need to put enough investment into areas where we have frontline workers who are essential workers to be able to carry out their jobs effectively and safely. And it hasn't been good enough. And people have died. Thousands of unnecessary lives have been lost. That's where I probably disagree with Andy in terms of how our governments have handled this. No, it's not good enough. There should have been contingencies. There was reports that warned them what they needed to do and the stockpiles they needed to have. That didn't get carried out. And we should have a situation where, as a country, we actually anticipate these things. It's not been good enough, and we shouldn't accept that thousands of lives have been lost unnecessarily because of bad decisions that have been made by our governments throughout this pandemic.
Drew Henry, the Nicola Sturgeon, in responding to the question, Rana Sawar said two things. Pointed out the Audit Scotland report generally had praised government efforts and government endeavour, and said that everything had been done, or as much has been done as possible. They actually didn't run out of PPE. They came close on occasion, but they managed not to. But she conceded not everything had been got right. In terms of planning, she said that perhaps they had prepared for a flu pandemic rather than the one that emerged, prepared for the wrong war, if you like. But those are remarkable statements by Ros Foyer. People have died as a consequence of government actions. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that Nicola Sturgeon's absolutely right, that lessons do have to be learned. I'm sure they've been learned, and they continue to learn from them. One of the things I think that came out quite clearly was that there was PPE here, but it was difficult to get it out to everybody in the time that there were risks in the fact that the PPE wasn't manufactured here. It now is manufactured in Scotland, so that we can respond better to these kinds of things. But look, frontline workers were on the front line literally during this, and they were exposed to risk because by virtue of the fact that they were dealing in our hospitals with people who were suffering from this dreadful virus. And I think, like I say, the important thing in terms of learning lessons now is that we move as quickly as we can to a full public inquiry across all four nations, not batting off for years, but a full public inquiry across all four nations very, very quickly, so that we can get to the bottom of the lessons that we can learn across the whole of the nations of the UK, and make sure that we've got the preparations in place to ensure that we can cope with things like this much, much better when they arise in the future.
Andy McKeever, I saw you nodding sagely throughout that. It's not an easy one, this one, is it? Because it was at the early stages of the pandemic, but it does appear to really still be raising anxieties and concerns.
Yeah, and so it should. I mean, there's no question about that. I think my wife's a doctor, so I've got a little bit of personal knowledge of what went on, and I think that we have to take silver linings from clouds, in my view. I think that there's no question that at the start of this, we can look back and say our governments did not perform well based on international evidence. Towards the end, with the vaccine rollout programme, we can clearly say the opposite. I'm not saying it balances out, it doesn't, right? But you save lives with a better vaccine programme, and you'd maybe cost lives with a poorer start to it. And I agree with all that. I do think the critical thing is that we do have an inquiry that looks at everything, because I know from my own personal experience, as I say, having my wife who's a doctor, there are many. The NHS works in a very different way than most other developed health services around the world, and in a totally different way than European health services. And there are some aspects of that which were a big benefit in this.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of aspects also that were a big disbenefit in this. And I would like to, I hope that the inquiry doesn't miss anything because it feels that it has to avoid certain topics. I think it should be very, very thorough so that we make sure that if this happens again, and let's face it, we have to prepare that it will happen again, that we get it right at the start.
Ros, on that very thing, good question in from Kathinka Mume saying, how do we ensure this doesn't happen again and that it isn't the low-paid hospitality staff that suffer? Again, she's concerned about that sector too.
Well, I think that on the issues that hospitality staff have faced, there's no doubt that the hospitality sector is a sector that's suffered more than most in this, and the staff have suffered very badly because you've got to think about it was the lucky ones that were placed on furlough and not just let go. And those lucky ones, when the sector was closed, were living on, 80% of minimum wage levels, and that's a very hard ask to be surviving on, not even the minimum wage.
The minimum wage, yeah.
Yes, okay. For quite prolonged periods of time. I mean, what we must do is try and learn the lessons of this, and there's no doubt that we need to think about raising standards of employment. And I'll go back again to the point I made earlier on around sick pay. That things like that are a real problem. When a worker has to choose between doing the right thing and isolating if they have symptoms, or not having enough money to feed their family, they're going to go to work in order to
go to work. Yeah.
They're going to take the risk.
Brian, Ros is absolutely right about that issue of sick pay, and one of the missed opportunities during this whole pandemic, one of the silver linings we could have found if it had been received by the Chancellor was for us to try out the opportunity of a universal basic income, which would have protected all the hospitality workers and everybody else during this time. And I don't believe that when we look back in the scale of the costs of this, it would have been out with our ability to actually put that in place. And I think there is still room for us to look at that for the future to make sure that nobody's left behind.
We'll talk about that in a future program, a big topic. But Alistair Grant, one issue as well that was raised at questions to the First Minister during her statement, as well as today, the idea of travel bans, aviation travel bans. Nicola Sturgeon saying basically, if Scotland had the power to do it, she would have had far tighter ones than the UK. Now, I understand the pressure that was on the UK government from the travel industry and from backbench Conservative MPs, and now they're talking about ways perhaps of validating international travel. This is still a source of concern, isn't it, Alistair?
It's still a source of concern. It's been a source of concern, as you say, a kind of ongoing issue for months. So I think one of the things that Nicola Sturgeon said during her coronavirus update in Holyrood on Tuesday was essentially she kind of blamed what she called the lax UK border controls effectively for the rise of the Delta variant. That was obviously kind of originated in India, or was first identified in India. And she essentially said that the Scottish Government wanted to introduce a kind of mandatory managed quarantine for everyone coming back from the UK, regardless of what country they're returning from, which would obviously have included India, whereas the UK government has obviously gone for this traffic light system. And there was concerns that they took too long to move India to the red list and allowed the Delta variant to enter the UK and to become kind of seeded. And this is an ongoing issue, and I suppose there's a lot of experts, a lot of public health officials that have raised this repeatedly. You look at other countries that have managed to kind of control their borders much more effectively. And it does, make sense in the sense that if new variants are going to enter the UK, they're going to enter it primarily from overseas travel. But I suppose one of the other issues is that the travel industry and the airlines are devastated at the moment, and there's a lot of pressure to kind of allow people to go abroad where that's possible. And
there's talk of legal action. Andy, does this come down to your balance again? It's this question of the balance. At what point, you want to contain the virus, you have a complete and total lockdown and nobody's allowed to go anywhere. Now, that's not feasible. This comes down to your question of balance, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. This all goes back, actually, to the question of elimination versus suppression. It goes back to New Zealand and the New Zealand model of effectively closing off the country completely to everything. I was never in favour of elimination as a strategy. I always thought it was the wrong strategy, because I felt that if you try and look in the longer term at what New Zealand were doing, it presumes global vaccination. And global vaccination is either impossible or so far away that you cannot credibly close your country for that long.
So you think the Australia-New Zealand close down might not work because they're going to have to wait until everybody else catches up on vaccination?
Unless they loosen it, yeah. Because when do you have a situation where all the countries that are effectively on the list to receive COVAX, when does that happen? When do they get to the point where and we're still very, very, very far away from that. And again, it is the balance. How much damage is being done to the New Zealand economy by this sustained closure? And the damage done to the economy means less tax, less money for public services, more people on unemployment, more people in poverty, more death. So again, it is all this balance. But you see, the difficult thing is if you're a politician, this is hard, because you are making a choice, effectively, a horrible choice between the deaths that are right in front of you and the deaths that are decades away. And inevitably, it's really, really easy to choose the first one, and it's really hard to choose the last one.
Ross Foy, what do you make of the approach being taken, the idea of controlling travel and controlling transport?
I think in the short term, there are certainly currently, given where we are with vaccines, arguments for continuing to have heightened travel restrictions. And I think there's a lot to be said for what the First Minister put down as the cause to the fact that we could be facing another spike with a more vigorous variant. But that said, I think longer term, we do have to realise that, we have a huge aviation sector, we have a huge travel sector, and that Britain as a country and as an economy is a global, it's interlinked to the global economy. Long-term shutting down your borders globally is not an answer, but maybe what we need to be doing as countries is, really, really getting serious about the need to look at a global vaccination programme, because my concern is that until we really bite the bullet on that and get to grips with that and realise...
And not just the vaccines, but the infrastructure to distribute those vaccines in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Drew Henry, you and your colleagues in the Commons were raising this week another issue regarding trade and connections with the Antipodes, but you weren't exactly delighted about that either, was it? It was the Australian trade deal.
Well, I think this has been a massive blow to the farming and crofting industry in Scotland. They've been absolutely devastated that they've been locked out of consultation over this deal. Basically, it's going to allow Australian products, sheep, lamb and beef products into the UK. Products that, and you've got to remember that Australian farming still allowed to use hormone injection in beef. They're allowed to mule sheep, I should say. They can transport live animals for 48 hours without food and water. And they're still using antibiotics and so forth in the production of their food. All this is going to come in and it risks seriously undercutting our farming industry. 14 of Scotland's food and drink bodies wrote to Liz Truss, the Secretary of State for Trade, to decry the way this has been handled. And I think there's more to come from this. The benefits from it. Just before that, if I could just point out the benefits from this. The benefits from this would take 15 years to get 1/200th of the loss that we've made from losing the EU market. So this is a tiny deal with devastating consequences for future actions in terms of farming.
Alistair Grant, the UK government Prime Minister, says it's up to our business. He talks about the opportunities for whisky, and of course, they have delighted to announce the further suspension of the additional tariffs on trade with America. But in terms of Australia, he says there are opportunities for UK firms. That's what the Prime Minister says? Alistair.
He does, yeah, and I think the UK government would also make the point that they've got this kind of transition period, this kind of 15-year period, and that they put measures in place to stop the country being, I guess you'd say, the market being flooded by Australian beef and lamb.
Yeah.
But, as Drew says, this is something that the farming sector is extremely concerned about for the perceived different standards between the UK and Australia when it comes to these products and the impact on particularly maybe kind of smaller Scottish farmers that would have to compete with these much bigger Australian farms. And I thought it was interesting today in Holyrood during First Minister's questions that Nicola Sturgeon was essentially saying there should be a vote in the House of Commons over this, but also a vote in Holyrood, because it's something that is affecting Scotland. And she says the Scottish Parliament should have a say on it.
Andy, what's your take? Are we getting to exercise too early, or is this a real threat?
This is what free trade is.
Yeah.
And I will any day of the week talk up for free trade. I think free trade is the best way to lift people out of poverty the world has ever seen. But free trade has consequences. And I wouldn't play those consequences down in this case. I think the consequences for farmers here could be quite significant, not necessarily just in isolation from the Australian deal, but from other free trade deals that will inevitably be announced in the future, because this will open up a whole Asia-Pacific free trade deal thing. Now, I would emphasise that I'm not against it, but I do think the consequences are quite profound. For me, this goes back to the CAP. Agriculture in this country is incredibly heavily subsidised, and you can debate the rights and wrongs of that. But ultimately, my view is that no EU policy has been as immoral over the years as the CAP. The CAP has kept Africans poor more than almost anything else that could possibly have been created by the rich world.
And this is a hangover of the
CAP. This is a hangover of the CAP. We have become used to massive subsidies, and this is what happens when they go away.
Drew Henry, briefly, I guess you would say it's free trade, but free and equal trade is what you would want.
Well, just to give you an example, everybody's delighted to sell more whiskey into Australia, but costs of goods for the whiskey industry, for distillers, have gone up by 20% since the 1st of January because of Brexit and the massive amount of trade they've lost to the EU. This can't even touch the sides of what's affecting them there. And the other important part, just on this, Brian, is that this undermines food security, because if farmers and crofts go out of business, then that means that we'll have to import more and more, and that's a very, very dangerous long-term effect.
Ros, briefly, what's your take on this? Good thing, bad thing?
Yeah, well, I think for me, it's the lack of transparency in how these deals are negotiated. The UK government clearly feels under real pressure to come up with, pull lots of trade deals out the bag, and the lack of scrutiny in what's in or not in those deals is a huge issue of concern. And, for obvious reasons, my key concern would be workers' rights in all of this, as well as things like food standards, safety, and a whole range of other concerns. But it's all getting done behind closed doors, and we're getting told about it once the deal's done. That's not good enough.
Not good enough. Folks, I'm going to call that to a halt, but we've got one more topic I really hesitate to raise this. That apparently there's a football tournament going on. I know. And we came close in the first game. They scored quite a good goal and then a ludicrous goal against us. And we've got another team that Scotland are playing on Friday. We're the famous Tartan Army, and some of us, or a few of us, are off to Wembley. How can we keep this going? Alistair, how can we ginger our spirits up? I mean, obviously by scoring more goals than England. Don't say that, but don't get that. We want that to happen. How can we get all cheered up by this, Alistair?
I suppose I've got to lay my cards on the table and say that I don't follow football. I'm not a huge football fan. But I watched the Czech Republic game. I'll definitely be watching at 8:00 tomorrow night. I'm not naive to the kind of the history of this fixture and what it means in terms of the game and the kind of history behind it. But in terms of giving advice or predictions, I'm probably not the guy to ask.
Which sport do you follow? Rugby, or you follow hockey, or
I'm just not. I don't really. This is making me sound really boring, but I don't really follow any of them really.
No, perfectly reasonable. Darts, snooker. No. I'm going to go back to that point. Ros, would it boost the nation hugely, or do we invest too much in football? Is that possibly a failing of the Scots males in particular, but some Scots females as well?
Well, I was just going to suggest that maybe we should send down the women's team, because they've got a better track record in international tournaments. But I think it's obviously something that does deeply seem to be part of our psyche, and there's a huge amount invested in it. And let's just hope that we don't end up with another glorious defeat. I would like to see a chink of light for allow all our Scottish men to put their heads up a little bit higher.
You're right about the glorious defeats. When we go out on goal difference or something stupid like that. We beat Holland and draw with Iran, wasn't it? That was one of them. That was Argentina.
Yeah.
It's always it's defeat, but it's always glorious. We score a wonderful. What was it that Jimmy Hill called it? A toe poke goal by Andy Neary against Brazil, and then it just annoyed me.
I was actually in Paris in 1998
when wonderful.
We played Brazil, and I was in the fan zone there. Didn't make it into the stadium for that game, but the point at which I think we were drawing with Brazil for about 20 minutes. I think that's probably the best thing that's ever happened to Scotland and football team in the last 30 years. The fans were
I was covering the European Summit in Cardiff, and I was commentating live on the Sheepmeat Premium or some blasted thing. And I was watching the game, of course, had the sound turned down, and I was getting away with it. But the Newsnight were next door, and then as now they had a large Scots contingent, and Scotland hit the bar against Brazil, and some guy from Newsnight shouted, "Oh yeah, blank dancer," and this went out on here, and I said, guys, what are you doing? He said, "Oh, you should have seen it," but I said, "I did see it, but I managed to keep quiet." And Andy, are we going to get bolstered up by Friday?
Well, it's possible.
This is gloomy. I'm going home. Go on, Andy.
It is. I mean, look, the first thing in our favour is history, because Scotland don't tend to go out after just the second game. Scotland tend to leave us on tenterhooks until the end before we make a hash of it. So, that is and really a draw tomorrow night keeps Scotland pretty much in the tournament. In fact, a loss potentially keeps them in, but we'll not deal with that just now. No. So a draw keeps them in. This is not the best Scotland team there has been, but there's also been worse, to be honest, over the last 10 or 15 years. And it's also not the best England team. There's a couple of particularly good England players. They're not gelling all that well. You wouldn't think that to hear some of the commentators, but go on, Well, I know, but I mean, we actually share a lot in common with England when it comes to football, because England are a significantly underperforming nation on the world stage in football. They have so many incredible players, but they never ever gel as well as a team. Listen, Andy, we are
better than they are at underperforming. We're better. We're better.
We are. There is I think there's a chance of taking a point out of tomorrow night, getting a draw tomorrow night, and then needing to beat Croatia, and probably losing a last minute goal to Croatia to go out or something like that. But I think there's a chance tomorrow night of taking enough.
Drew, cheer us up. What's going to happen?
Well, I think this time we'll either go through on points or on goal difference. I don't think we're going to go out this time. So I know you're a Dundee United fan, Brian. I'm a Hearts fan. So we know that when you hit the down times, that just makes the victories and the successes that.
You try to keep us out of the Premier League as well. Don't think we'll forget that.
I think you guys succeeded in keeping us out. But anyway, I think the lesson from that is that if you get knocked down, you pick yourself up again, you go again, and I think that's what we'll do tomorrow night.
Well, there you are. Drew Henry's upbeat. Andy McKeever thinks we'll leave it to the last game to get beat. Ross Foyer thinks that we should maybe just cool down and send the women, and Alistair Grant couldn't care less whatever happened. So my panel, thank you very, very much indeed. It was absolutely fabulous. Thanks very much for joining me. Thanks to everybody who's listening either live or on the recorded version. From me, Brian Taylor, toodaloo the